The blizzard of 1883 didn't just bring ice to the Bitterroot Mountains, it brought trouble. When a hardened mountain man found a half-dead woman in the snow, he thought he was merely saving a life. But as she lay shivering by his hearth, clutching her torn coat and whispering, "Please don't take it off," he realized too late that some secrets are deadlier than the cold. What if found beneath her clothes would change both of their lives forever, unearthing a violent past neither could escape. The winter of 1883 hit the Montana Territory with a ferocity that old-timers would talk about for decades. In the high, jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, the wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It tore through the pines like a freight train, burying the landscape under feet of blinding, suffocating white. For Gideon Reed, a solitary mountain man and trapper who made his home near the treacherous frozen banks of Trapper's Creek, it was just another season to survive. Gideon was a man carved from the very mountains he inhabited. Broad-shouldered, heavily bearded, with eyes the color of a winter sky, he had left civilization behind years ago. Once a highly decorated scout for the Union Army, the blood and noise of the war had soured his taste for humanity. Now his only companions were the silence of the woods, a sturdy cabin built from raw pine, and a heavy Sharps rifle he trusted more than any living soul. It was the third day of the whiteout when Gideon found her. He had ventured out on snowshoes, wrapped in a thick buffalo hide, desperate to check a trap line before the ice buried it entirely. The temperature had plunged to 30 below zero. The air burned his lungs with every breath. That was when he saw it, a dark shape half buried in a snowdrift beneath a cluster of dead spruces. At first, he thought it was a downed elk, but as he pushed through the chest-high drifts, the shape resolved into the frozen carcass of a roan horse. And slumped beside it, covered in a thin, useless layer of blue wool, was a woman. Gideon dropped his traps and fell to his knees. He brushed the snow from her face. Her skin was the color of porcelain, her lips a bruised, terrifying blue. Ice crystals clung to her dark eyelashes. She was completely unresponsive, her pulse so faint, Gideon had to press his bare fingers hard against her throat to feel the weak, thready flutter. She was dying. In this cold, she had maybe 20 minutes left before her heart simply gave up the fight. Without a second thought, Gideon hoisted her into his arms. She was dangerously light, her body stiff with the freezing cold. He abandoned his trap line and began the brutal mile-long trek back to his cabin, fighting against wind gusts that threatened to knock him off his feet. Every step was a battle of will. The cold bit into his exposed face like broken glass, but he kept his head down, shielding her as best he could against his broad chest. When he finally kicked open the heavy oak door of his cabin, the sudden warmth of the dying hearth fire felt like a physical blow. He kicked the door shut against the howling storm and laid her gently on the thick, bare rug positioned in front of the stone fireplace. Gideon moved with practiced, urgent efficiency. He threw 3 heavy logs onto the embers, watching the flames roar back to life, casting dancing orange shadows across the small room. He knew the brutal mechanics of hypothermia. The only way to save her was to get her out of the frozen wet clothing and apply external heat immediately. He knelt beside her and began to unbutton the heavy, ice-caked wool coat. Her hands were clenched into tight fists, completely unresponsive. As he pulled the heavy coat away, he noticed a dark, frozen stain spreading across the left side of her pale cotton blouse. Blood, and a lot of it. Frowning, Gideon reached for the hem of her blouse to inspect the wound, but as his fingers brushed the fabric, the woman's eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, terrified hazel. Before Gideon could react, she moved with a sudden feral burst of adrenaline, her freezing hands shooting up to grip his wrist with surprising strength. "No," she gasped, her voice nothing but a dry, rattling wheeze. "Easy now," Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He kept his hands still, trying to project calm. "You're safe. I brought you out of the storm, but you're bleeding and you're half frozen. I need to get these wet clothes off you, or you'll be dead before sundown." She shook her head frantically, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. Beneath the thin, wet cotton of her blouse, Gideon could feel something rigid and unnatural. It felt like thick, hardened leather, strapped tightly around her torso, heavily buckled and laced. The blood was seeping directly from beneath it. "I have to look at the wound," Gideon pressed, leaning closer. "You're losing blood." "No," she cried out, panic flashing in her eyes. She weakly tried to push him away, curling her body to protect her left side. Don't touch it. Promise me." Gideon stared at her bewildered. The woman was delirious, freezing, and bleeding out, yet she was guarding whatever was under her shirt as if it were more precious than her own life. He had seen men die on battlefields clutching photographs of their wives, but this was different. This was sheer, unadulterated terror. "All right," Gideon said softly, backing off slightly to ease her panic. "All right, I won't take it off, but I have to warm you up." He settled for wrapping her in 3 thick woolen blankets, piling them high over her shivering form. He boiled a pot of water over the fire, brewing a strong willow bark tea to help with the pain and fever he knew was coming. For the rest of the day, as the blizzard battered the heavy timber walls of the cabin, Gideon sat in a rocking chair by the hearth watching her. Her name, he would later learn, was Abigail Stanton. But for now, she was a mystery. A beautiful broken mystery who had brought the smell of blood and secrets into his isolated sanctuary. Gideon cleaned his rifle, his eyes never leaving her pale face. He had a sinking feeling in his gut. The wilderness had a way of punishing those who brought their sins into it, and whatever Abigail was hiding beneath that blood-soaked leather, Gideon knew it was bound to bring hell right to his doorstep. By the second night, the storm showed no signs of breaking, and Abigail's condition had drastically worsened. The hypothermia had receded, replaced by a raging, consuming fever. The cabin was sweltering, the stone hearth radiating intense heat, but Abigail thrashed beneath the heavy wool blankets, drenched in a cold, sickly sweat. Her skin was flushed, burning to the touch, and her breathing had become shallow and ragged. Gideon sat by her side, a damp rag in his hand, continually pressing it to her burning forehead. He had tried to feed her broth, but she couldn't keep it down. She muttered in her delirium fractured sentences about a man named Josiah, a stagecoach in Bannock, and a ledger. Gideon listened, his jaw tight. Bannock was a gold rush town down in the valley, a place notorious for corruption and violence. If she had run from there, she had run from the devil himself. But the most pressing issue was the smell. The coppery scent of dried blood had shifted into something sweeter, sicker. Infection. Sepsis was setting in. Gideon didn't need a medical degree to know that the wound hidden beneath the rigid leather corset she wore was turning necrotic. If he didn't clean it, cut away the dead flesh, and cauterize it, the infection would reach her blood, and she would die a slow, agonizing death by morning. He set the rag aside and looked at her. She was barely conscious, her head rolling side to side on the pillow. "I'm sorry, girl," Gideon muttered into the quiet cabin, "but I ain't letting you die on my floor." He reached into his boot and pulled out his hunting knife, testing the razor-sharp edge with his thumb. He walked over to the fire and held the blade directly in the flames until the steel glowed a dull, angry orange. He set it on the stone hearth to cool just slightly, then gathered clean rags, a bottle of harsh, high-proof rye whiskey, and a needle and thread. Kneeling back down beside her, he gently pulled the blankets back. She was wearing the same blood-stained cotton blouse. Gideon unbuttoned it quickly, revealing the garment beneath. It was a heavy, boiled leather bodice, reinforced with steel stays and held together by intricate, tightly knotted leather laces. It was the kind of thing used for orthopedic support, or for hiding something completely. As Gideon's large, calloused hands reached for the top lace, Abigail's eyes fluttered open. Through the haze of the fever, she realized what he was doing. A desperate, animalistic sob tore from her throat. She weakly grabbed his wrist, her grip slipping against his skin due to her sweat. "Please," she trembled, tears spilling over her flushed cheeks, mixing with the sweat. "Please don't take it off. He'll know. He'll find me." Gideon paused, looking down into her terrified eyes. The sheer panic in her voice struck a chord deep within him. "Who will find you?" Gideon asked, his voice low and steady. "Don't look," she begged, coughing violently, a spasm of pain racking her small frame. "If you see it, you'll send me back. You'll think I'm one of them. Please." Gideon softened his grip, but his resolve remained absolute. "I don't care who you are running from. I don't care what you've done, but you are rotten from the inside out. That wound is infected. If I don't take this off and clean it, you will not live to see the sun rise. Now let go of my arm." "No," she wept, trying to fight him, but she had no strength left. Her hand fell away, landing limply on the floorboards. Gideon didn't hesitate anymore. The knots on the leather were swollen with dried blood and sweat, impossible to untie. He took his knife and carefully slipped the blade beneath the thick laces, slicing them upward in one swift, clean motion. The leather corset popped open with a stiff creak. Gideon gently pulled the rigid leather away from her ribs. Then he stopped cold. The breath hitched in his throat, and the cabin suddenly felt entirely too small, the air too thin. It wasn't a bullet wound. It wasn't a knife slash. High on her left shoulder, stretching down toward her collarbone, the flesh was raw, blistered, and violently inflamed. But it was the shape of the wound that made Gideon's blood run like ice water through his veins. Burned deeply into her pale skin was a brand. The letter C, twisted and intertwined with the shape of a striking rattlesnake. The mark of the Callahan gang. Gideon stared at it, the glowing knife forgotten on the hearth. Josiah Callahan was a name whispered with dread across the Montana and Idaho territories. He wasn't just a cattle rustler or a stagecoach robber. Callahan was a warlord, a ruthless, sadistic killer who left trails of burned-out homesteads and orphaned children in his wake. And he was known to brand the women he claimed as his own personal property, marking them like cattle. But seeing the brand wasn't the only thing that shocked Gideon. Tucked tightly against her ribs, previously hidden by the heavy leather bodice, was a flat oilskin pouch, securely tied with twine. Gideon looked from the horrific, infected burn mark to Abigail's face. She had passed out from the pain and exertion, her head lolled to the side, a dark, long-buried fury ignited in Gideon's chest. He knew that brand intimately. 3 years ago, in the dusty streets of Bozeman, Josiah Callahan had put a bullet through the back of the head of Samuel Ford, a local deputy, and the only man in this godforsaken territory Gideon had ever called a friend. Gideon had hunted Callahan for 6 months, but the outlaw had slipped into the Dakota Badlands, shielded by corrupt politicians and paid-off lawmen. Now, one of Callahan's branded women was bleeding out on his floor. Gideon's hand shook, not with fear, but with a cold, righteous anger. He reached down, grabbed the bottle of whiskey, and uncorked it with his teeth. "You ain't dying tonight," Gideon whispered to the unconscious woman. "You and I have a lot to talk about." He poured the harsh alcohol directly onto the infected brand. Abigail's body arched violently off the floor, a muffled shriek tearing from her lips even in her unconscious state. Gideon held her down with one massive hand, grabbing the red-hot knife with the other. Without flinching, he pressed the glowing flat of the blade against the necrotic edges of the burn, searing away the rot. The smell of burned flesh filled the cabin, mixing with the wood smoke. It was a gruesome, necessary violence. When it was over, Gideon packed the wound with a salve of pine pitch and yarrow, wrapping her shoulder tightly in clean white linen. Then he sat back in his rocking chair, picking up the oilskin pouch. He untied the twine and opened it. Inside was a thick leather-bound ledger. He flipped open the pages, his eyes scanning the neat, precise handwriting, dates, amounts of gold, and names. It was a payoff ledger, and the names listed inside were enough to hang half the lawmen in the Montana Territory, including Dalton Hayes, the sheriff of Bannock, and Henry Wilkins, a federal circuit judge. Gideon snapped the book shut. The wind howled outside, slamming against the cabin walls. Abigail Stanton wasn't just a victim. She was carrying the one thing that could destroy Josiah Callahan's empire. And Callahan's men would burn down these entire mountains to get it back. It was mid-morning of the fourth day when the fever finally broke. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a piercingly bright, silent world of blinding white snow and crystal blue skies. Abigail opened her eyes slowly. Her mouth tasted like dry ash, and a dull, throbbing ache pulsed in her left shoulder, but the blinding, disorienting heat of the fever was gone. She blinked against the sunlight streaming through the cabin's single frost-rimed window. She was lying in a large, comfortable bed in the corner of the cabin, covered in heavy quilts. She moved her arm and winced, instantly realizing that she was wearing one of Gideon's oversized flannel shirts. Panic flared in her chest. She reached instinctively for her ribs, searching for the rigid leather corset, searching for the pouch. It was gone. "Looking for this?" Abigail gasped and pushed herself up against the wooden headboard, clutching the quilt to her chest. Gideon was sitting at the heavy oak table in the center of the room. Hay was cleaning the mechanism of his Sharps rifle with an oiled rag. Sitting on the table next to a cup of steaming coffee was the oilskin pouch, the ledger resting openly beside it. Gideon didn't look up from his rifle. His voice was calm, but it carried a heavy, dangerous weight. "You've been asleep for nearly 2 days," he said, slotting a piece of the rifle back into place with a sharp metallic click. "Fever nearly took you. Had to burn the rot out of that brand on your shoulder." Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, a wave of shame and terror washing over her. She pulled her knees to her chest. "You saw it?" "Hard not to," Gideon replied, finally looking up. His blue eyes were piercing, evaluating her. "The letter C and a serpent, Josiah Callahan's mark. I know what it means. He puts it on his cattle, and he puts it on his women so no one else dares touch 'em. I am not his woman," Abigail practically screamed, the sudden force of her voice surprising them both. She trembled, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the quilt. Tears of anger, not sadness, sprang to her eyes. "I am not a whore, and I am not his property. I was the schoolteacher in the Bannock." Gideon raised an eyebrow, setting the oily rag down. I'd leaned back in his chair. "A schoolteacher, carrying a ledger that proves the mayor, Sheriff Dalton Hayes, and Judge Henry Wilkins have been taking blood money from the Callahan gang for 3 years. That's a hell of a curriculum." Abigail swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. If she was going to die here, she wouldn't do it cowering. "My name is Abigail Stanton. 2 months ago, I was staying late at the schoolhouse. It's right behind the sheriff's office. I heard shouting. I looked through the window, and I saw Josiah Callahan put a knife into the throat of a federal marshal who had come sniffing around about the bribes. Sheriff Hayes just stood there and watched. Then Hayes handed Callahan that ledger to hide it because a Pinkerton detective was due in town the next morning." Gideon listened in absolute silence. The pieces were falling into place. "I tried to sneak away," Abigail continued, her voice dropping to a haunted whisper, her eyes staring at the wooden floorboards. "But I stepped on a piece of broken glass. They heard me. Callahan He didn't kill me. He said I was too pretty to waste. He dragged me out to his ranch. He branded me." Her hand drifted up to lightly touch the bandages on her shoulder. "He said it was so everyone in the territory would know who I belonged to. He was going to sell me to a mining camp down in Nevada once the heat died down." "How did you get the ledger?" Gideon asked softly. "I stole it from his saddlebags," Abigail said, a fierce spark of defiance returning to her eyes. 3 nights ago, he got drunk celebrating a successful stagecoach robbery. I slipped out of the bunkhouse, took the ledger, and stole a horse. I rode straight up into the mountains because I knew a blizzard was coming. I knew they wouldn't want to follow me into the ice, but my horse slipped on a frozen ridge, broke its leg. I had to put it down. I walked until I couldn't walk anymore. Gideon stared at her. Beneath the fragility, beneath the trauma and the fear, was a core of absolute, unbreakable steel. She had survived a brutal branding, stolen the most dangerous book in the territory from the most dangerous man in the West, and rode headlong into a killer blizzard just to escape. "You're a brave woman, Abigail Stanton," Gideon said quietly. "I'm a dead woman," she corrected him bitterly. "Callahan's trackers are the best in the territory. The blizzard stopped them, but now that the sky is clear, they'll find my horse. And then they'll find this cabin. By helping me, you've signed your own death warrant. You should have left me in the snow. You should give me the ledger, give me a pair of snowshoes, and let me leave before they arrive." Gideon slowly stood up. He walked over to the table, picked up the ledger, and placed it back into the oilskin pouch. He tied it securely. Then he's picked up his Sharps rifle. "3 years ago," Gideon said, his back to her as he looked out the frost-covered window toward the tree line, "Josiah Callahan shot a man named Samuel Ford in the back of the head. Sam was a good man, left behind a wife and a little girl. I spent 6 months tracking Callahan, but he always had the law running interference for him. I gave up. I came up into those mountains to forget the world, to forget the blood." Gideon turned around and looked at Abigail. The cold, detached look of the mountain hermit was gone. In its place was the hardened, lethal stare of the Union scout who had survived the bloodiest battles of the war. "I'm not giving you snowshoes, Abigail," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble of thunder, "and I'm not running." He walked over to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his own bed, kicked open the iron latch, and threw open the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, were 2 perfectly maintained Colt 45 revolvers and a leather bandolier heavy with brass ammunition. "Let them come," Gideon said, pulling the revolvers from the chest and spinning the cylinders with a deadly practiced grace. "I've been waiting 3 years for Josiah Callahan to step foot on my mountain. It's time to settle accounts." For the next 2 days, the cabin on Trapper's Creek transformed from a solitary hunter's refuge into a fortress of wood and iron. The brilliant, blinding sunshine that followed the blizzard did nothing to warm the Bitterroot Mountains. The temperature hovered in the single digits, freezing the deep snow into a hard, crystalline crust that could support a man's weight, making travel possible for the men Gideon knew were coming. Gideon worked with a grim, methodical focus. He shuttered the windows with heavy pine planks, using his auger to bore narrow firing ports through the thick wood. He hauled up buckets of water from the half-frozen creek and set them in the corners of the room, preparing for the very real possibility that Josiah Callahan's men would try to burn them out. Abigail did not sit idle. Though her left shoulder still throbbed with a dull, sickening heat, the infection had been beaten back by Gideon's brutal cauterization and the bitter willow bark tea. She insisted on helping, moving with a stiff but determined grace. She loaded spare cylinders for Gideon's Colt revolvers, her slender, ink-stained fingers that had once guided children through McGuffey readers in a quiet Bannock schoolhouse, now pressing heavy lead cartridges into cold steel. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks and cast long, bruised shadows across the snow, Gideon walked over to the table and set a Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle in front of her. "I know you ain't a killer, Abigail," Gideon said, his voice softer than the rough scrape of a whetstone. "But out here, God and the law are both a long way off. If they breach that door, and I'm not standing between them and you, I need to know you can pull this trigger." Abigail stared at the blued steel of the rifle. She had never fired a weapon in her life. Her world had been one of books, chalkboards, and quiet evenings. But that world had been shattered the night Callahan dragged her into the dirt. She reached out and wrapped her hands around the walnut stalk. "Show me." Gideon stepped behind her. The cabin was small, and his massive frame seemed to swallow the space around her. He reached around her, his large, calloused hands gently covering hers, guiding them to the proper positions on the rifle. The proximity sent a sudden, unexpected shiver down Abigail's spine that had nothing to do with the freezing draft leaking through the floorboards. "Keep the butt tight against your shoulder," Gideon murmured, his breath warm against the shell of her ear. "Not the left one. Use your right. Don't fight the recoil. Let it push into you. Look down the barrel. See that front blade? Put it right in the center of the rear notch." Abigail swallowed hard, hyper-aware of the solid wall of his chest against her back. The scent of him, wood smoke, leather, and strong coffee, was grounding. For the first time since the night in Bannock, she didn't feel like prey. She felt anchored. "When you fire," Gideon continued, stepping back just slightly, though his eyes never left her face, "you don't hesitate. You don't aim to wound. Callahan's men, Reuben Cole, Deacon Miller, those animals, they won't offer you a second of mercy. You shoot to kill, or you don't pull the hammer back. Understood." Abigail lowered the rifle, turning to face him. The firelight danced in her hazel eyes, catching a fierce, unbroken spirit that left Gideon momentarily breathless. "I understand," she said quietly. She looked down at the floor, suddenly vulnerable. "Gideon, if they take me, if they get past you, I won't let them take me alive. Promise me you understand that." Gideon closed the distance between them, stopping inches away. He reached up, his rough fingers gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. It was a remarkably tender gesture from a man whose hands were built for violence. "They aren't taking you," Gideon said, his voice a gravelly vow. "I let a good man die 3 years ago because I wasn't fast enough. I've lived with Sam Ford's ghost every day since. But I swear to you on my own soul, Abigail Stanton, Josiah Callahan will bleed out in the snow before he ever lays another hand on you." A heavy silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of shared trauma and unspoken promises. Abigail looked up into his winter sky eyes, seeing the deep, jagged scars of a man who had fought a war long after the armies had surrendered. Without thinking, she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest. Gideon stiffened for a fraction of a second before slowly wrapping his arms around her, holding her tightly against him. For a fleeting moment in the heart of the frozen wilderness, there was peace. Then from the ridge a half-mile away, the sharp, echoing crack of a snapping pine bough shattered the silence. Gideon pulled back instantly, the tenderness vanishing from his eyes, replaced by the lethal instinct of a predator. He grabbed his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle and moved to the shuttered window, peering out into the twilight. "They found the horse," Gideon whispered, thumbing back the massive hammer of the rifle. "The wolves are at the door." The vanguard of Callahan's posse didn't come howling like Apaches. They came like ghosts, slipping through the snow-laden pines with terrifying silence. Through the narrow firing port, Gideon spotted the movement, 3 shadows detaching themselves from the tree line. At the front was a man in a heavy wolfskin coat, Deacon Miller, Callahan's chief tracker, a man who could read a trail on solid rock. Behind him were 2 other hard-eyed killers, armed with repeating rifles, scanning the clearing that surrounded Gideon's cabin. Gideon knew a siege was a losing man's game. If he let them surround the cabin, it was only a matter of time before they tossed a kerosene lantern onto the pine shingle roof. I had to dictate the terms of the fight. He had to take the war to them. "Lock the door behind me," Gideon ordered, pulling his heavy buffalo hide over his shoulders and checking the twin Colts at his hips. "You're going out there?" Abigail asked, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the Winchester. "I'm a scout," Gideon replied, a dangerous smile touching the corners of his mouth. The woods are my home. They're just trespassing. Do not open this door for anyone but me. If the handle turns and you don't hear my voice, you empty that rifle through the wood. You hear me?" "Yes," she breathed. Gideon slipped out the back door, disappearing into the biting cold of the mountain night. Abigail immediately dropped the heavy iron bar across the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence that followed was agonizing. Outside, Gideon moved with a terrifying grace, his snowshoes gliding silently over the frozen crust. He circled wide, using the dense brush and the deep shadows of the towering spruces to flank the approaching trackers. Deacon Miller was standing waist-deep in a drift, pointing toward the thin wisp of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. "She's in there." Miller's raspy voice carried clearly on the frigid air. "Boss wants the ledger intact. We burn the cabin, the book burns with it. We breach the door." Not today, Gideon thought. He raised the massive Sharps rifle, the heavy octagonal barrel resting against the trunk of a dead pine. He settled his breathing, letting the icy air fill his lungs, and squeezed the set trigger. The roar of the buffalo rifle shattered the mountain's quiet like a clap of thunder. A massive .50 caliber slug tore through the frigid air and struck the outlaw standing to Deacon's left, lifting the man entirely off his feet and throwing him backward into a snowdrift. He didn't even have time to scream. "Sniper!" Deacon roared, diving behind a fallen log as the echo of the gunshot rolled through the valley. The second outlaw panicked, raising his rifle and firing blindly into the tree line. Gideon didn't stay to admire his work. The Sharps was a single-shot weapon, devastating but slow to reload. He dropped it in the snow and drew his twin Colts, sprinting through the trees with terrifying speed. The second outlaw was still jacking the lever of his rifle when Gideon burst from the brush 10 yards away, a Damon draped in buffalo hide. Gideon fired twice the heavy .45 caliber rounds, taking the man in the chest, dropping him instantly in a spray of red snow. Suddenly, a searing pain tore across Gideon's ribs. Deacon Miller had flanked him. The tracker stood in the shadows, smoke pouring from the barrel of his revolver. Deacon grinned, revealing a mouth of rotten teeth, cocking his gun for a second shot. "I know you," Deacon spat. "Gideon Reed, the man who came looking for Callahan and Bozeman, should have stayed hiding, Reed. Boss is going to mount your head on his wall." Before Deacon could pull the trigger, Gideon threw himself to the ground, bringing both Colts up in a desperate arc. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. 2 shots went wide, snapping branches above Deacon's head, but the third caught the tracker squarely in the throat. Deacon gasped, dropping his gun, clutching his neck as he collapsed into the snow, thrashing wildly before going completely still. Gideon lay in the snow for a moment, his breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. He pressed a gloved hand to his ribs. The bullet had grazed him, a shallow, bleeding furrow along his rib cage, but nothing fatal. He hauled himself up, retrieved his Sharps, and began the trek back to the cabin. But as he approached the clearing, his blood ran cold. A fourth man, Reuben Cole, Callahan's most vicious lieutenant, had used the gunfire in the woods as a distraction. Cole had bypassed the gunfight entirely and was currently taking an axe to the front door of the cabin. "Abigail!" Gideon roared, breaking into a dead sprint across the open snow. Inside the cabin, Abigail was backed against the far wall, the Winchester raised. The heavy oak door shuddered violently with every blow of Cole's axe. Wood splintered. The iron bar groaned in its brackets. "Come on out, little bird," Cole hollered from the porch, his voice dripping with sadistic glee. "Josiah's mighty upset you took his reading material. He's gonna brand the other shoulder just for practice." With a final deafening crack, the door hinges gave way and the heavy oak crashed inward. Reuben Cole stepped into the cabin, a massive, scarred man smelling of cheap whiskey and sweat, his revolver drawn. Abigail didn't scream, she didn't freeze. Gideon's voice echoed in her mind, "You shoot to kill, or you don't shoot at all." She pulled the trigger. The Winchester bucked against her injured shoulder, a bolt of blinding pain lancing through her, but the bullet flew true. It caught Reuben Cole high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He bellowed in rage and shock, his own gun discharging into the floorboards as he stumbled backward. Before Cole could recover and raise his weapon again, a massive shadow filled the broken doorway. Gideon Reed stood there, his coat stained with blood, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't say a word. He simply raised his Colt and fired a single shot directly into Reuben Cole's chest. Cole stared down at the bloomin' red stain on his shirt, then looked up at Gideon with empty, lifeless eyes before crashing backward off the porch into the snow. The silence that rushed back into the cabin was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the hearth fire and Abigail's ragged breathing. Gideon stepped inside, his boots crunching on the splintered wood of the door. He holstered his gun and looked at her. She was shaking, the rifle lowered, but her eyes were steady. "Are you hurt?" Gideon asked, his voice rough with adrenaline. "No," Abigail lied, trying to mask the agonizing pain radiating from the recoil against her branded shoulder. She looked at the blood seeping through Gideon's coat. "You're bleeding." "It's just a scratch," Gideon dismissed, though he winced as he walked over to the table. They had won the night. But as Gideon looked out through the shattered doorway at the darkened, unforgiving mountains, he knew the truth. Deacon Miller and Reuben Cole were just the hunting dogs. The master was still out there. "Pack the ledger," Gideon said quietly, tossing a heavy canvas rucksack onto the table. "They know where we are now, and Josiah Callahan won't send 3 men next time. He'll send 20. We can't hold this cabin." "Where do we go?" Abigail asked, grabbing the oilskin pouch. "Up," Gideon replied, his blue eyes hardening into ice. "Up into the high passes where the horses can't go. If Josiah Callahan wants this ledger, he's going to have to follow me into hell to get it." The escape was a grueling descent into a different kind of frozen hell. Gideon led Abigail away from the burning ruin of the cabin's front door, guiding her by moonlight toward a treacherous incline known by local trappers as the Devil's Staircase. It was a jagged, nearly vertical spine of granite and ice that cut directly into the upper elevations of the Bitterroots, an area so unforgiving even the local Nez Perce tribes avoided it in winter. Every step was a battle against gravity and the bitter, biting wind. Abigail's boots slipped on the icy crust, her breath coming in ragged white plumes. The recoil from firing the Winchester had reopened the raw, cauterized flesh of her branded shoulder. She could feel the warm, sticky seep of blood soaking through her bandages and into the heavy wool coat Gideon had wrapped her in. But she bit her lip until it tasted of copper, refusing to utter a single complaint. Gideon was a machine forged from survival, breaking trail through waist-deep snowdrifts with his powerful legs. Yet, every few minutes he would stop, turn, and offer his large gloved hand to pull her up over a particularly sheer ledge. His grip was an anchor in the spinning, freezing dark. Hours bled into one another. When they finally crested the ridge just before dawn, Gideon pulled her into the shelter of a shallow overhang beneath a massive granite boulder. The wind howled furiously above them, but here, tucked into the stone, it was dead quiet. "Sit," Gideon commanded softly, gently pushing her down onto a dry patch of stone. He shrugged off his heavy buffalo coat and laid it over her shivering form. Abigail looked up at him in the dim slate-gray light of morning. His face was pale, his jaw set in a tight line of pain. For the first time, she noticed the dark crimson stain spreading down the side of his shirt from the bullet graze he had taken in the woods. "You're bleeding again," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. "It'll cape," Gideon muttered, pulling a canteen from his pack and uncorking it. He handed it to her. "Drink. We only have an hour before the sun fully rises. Once it does, Callahan will see our tracks. They'll be coming fast." Abigail took a sip of the icy water, then set the canteen down. She reached out, her small, trembling hands grasping the hem of his bloodied shirt. Take it off, Gideon. Let me pack the wound with snow to stop the bleeding. You can't fight if you bleed out on this mountain. Gideon hesitated, looking into her hazel eyes. The fierce independence he saw there humbled him. Slowly he unbuttoned the heavy flannel and pulled it back, exposing a torso heavily scarred by old war wounds and the fresh, jagged furrow along his rib cage. Abigail worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady as she pressed a handful of clean snow against the gouge. Gideon hissed through his teeth, his muscles bunching, but he didn't pull away. "Why are you doing this, Gideon?" Abigail asked, her voice barely a whisper in the freezing air. "You could have handed me over. You could have given them the ledger. You don't owe me your life." "I told you," Gideon said, his gaze fixed on the snow swirling outside their small sanctuary. "I owe Sam Ford," and he trailed off, finally looking down at her. The harshness in his eyes had melted, replaced by a profound, startling vulnerability. "And I spent 3 years living like a ghost up here. I thought the world was nothing but ugly, brutal men. Then I found you in the snow, a woman who was broken, branded, and hunted, but still had the fire to steal the devil's ledger and ride into a blizzard." He reached up, his rough thumb gently wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "You reminded me that some things in this world are still worth dying for, Abigail." A heavy, charged silence hung between them, louder than the howling wind. Abigail leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "I don't want you to die for me, Gideon. I want you to live for me." Gideon's hand moved to cup her face, pulling her closer. When his lips met hers, it wasn't a desperate, frantic kiss of the doomed. It was a promise. It tasted of wood smoke, copper, and undeniable resolve. In the freezing shadow of the Devil's Staircase, they found a sudden blinding warmth in each other, but the moment was shattered by a sound rising from the valley below. It was the deep, resonant blast of a hunting horn, followed by the faint, rhythmic crack of rifle fire echoing off the canyon walls. Gideon broke the kiss, his eyes snapping open, instantly turning hard and lethal again. He moved to the edge of the overhang and peered down the sheer drop of the mountain. Far below, winding their way up the trail like a line of black ants against the white snow, were at least 15 men on horseback, leading fresh mounts. At the front of the pack, riding a massive black stallion, was a man wearing a long duster, a scoped rifle resting across his saddle horn. Even from this distance, the sheer predatory aura of the man was unmistakable. Josiah Callahan had arrived. "They brought mountain horses," Gideon said grimly, reaching for his sharps. "They'll be up here in less than an hour. Let's move." They pushed higher, climbing past the tree line into the barren, windswept summit of the pass. The air grew perilously thin. Every breath burned like inhaling broken glass. Gideon led Abigail toward a narrow natural bridge of ice and rock that spanned a dizzying 300-foot gorge known as Dead Man's Drop. On the other side of the gorge lay the descent into the Idaho Territory and safety. But the bridge was barely 4 feet wide, slick with black ice and entirely exposed. As they reached the edge of the chasm, a bullet suddenly ricocheted off the granite inches from Gideon's head, showering them with rock shards. "Get down!" Gideon roared, shoving Abigail behind an outcropping of jagged stone. He spun around, dropping to one knee, and raised his buffalo rifle. 100 yards back down the trail, Josiah Callahan and 5 of his best men had dismounted. They were advancing on foot, moving carefully from cover to cover. "Well, well, well!" Josiah Callahan's voice carried over the howling wind, smooth, arrogant, and dripping with venom. "If it isn't the ghost of Bozeman, Gideon Reed. I thought you crawled into a cave and died, boy." "I'm still breathing, Josiah," Gideon shouted back. He cocked the heavy hammer of the sharps. "Can't say the same for Deacon or Reuben." Callahan laughed, a dry, grating sound. He stepped out from behind a boulder, supremely confident, his scoped hunting rifle held loosely in his hands. He was a tall, lean man with cold, dead eyes and a neat mustache. He looked less like an outlaw and more like a corrupt aristocrat. "I don't care about those dogs," Callahan called out, "but I do care about my property. Send the girl over, Reed. Send her over with my book, and I'll let you walk away. You have my word as a gentleman." "You're no gentleman, Callahan," Abigail screamed from behind the rock, her voice trembling, not with fear but with pure rage. "You're a butcher." Callahan's eyes narrowed, locking onto the boulder where Abigail hid. "I branded you once, teacher. When I get you back to Bannock, I'm going to flay that brand off you and start fresh." Callahan motioned to his men. "Kill him. Take the girl alive. Get the book." The outlaws surged forward, firing wildly. Bullets chipped away at the rock shielding Gideon and Abigail. Gideon fired the sharps, the massive roar echoing over the gorge. The .50 caliber slug punched completely through the chest of the lead outlaw, throwing him backward into the snow. Gideon dropped the empty rifle, drew his twin Colts, and laid down a suppressing fire. "Run, Abigail!" he shouted over the deafening gunfire. "Cross the bridge! I'm not leaving you!" she cried, gripping the Winchester. "Cross it now!" Gideon barked. "I'll hold them here. I'll follow you." Tears streaming down her face, freezing instantly on her cheeks, Abigail clutched the oilskin pouch tightly to her chest, slung the Winchester over her good shoulder, and stepped out onto the terrifying expanse of Dead Man's Drop. The wind tore at her clothes, threatening to throw her into the abyss. She didn't look down. She kept her eyes fixed on the far side, moving as quickly as the ice would allow. Seeing her break from cover, Callahan cursed. "The book! She has the book!" He raised his scoped rifle, taking careful aim at Abigail's back. Gideon saw the warlord taking aim. With a furious roar, Gideon stepped out of cover entirely, exposing himself to the remaining gunmen. He leveled his right Colt and fired. The bullet shattered the wooden stock of Callahan's rifle just as the outlaw pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, striking the ice inches from Abigail's boot, but Callahan's men returned fire instantly. 2 bullets tore into Gideon's left leg and thigh. He collapsed to one knee, gritting his teeth against the searing agony, but he kept firing, dropping another outlaw in his tracks. Seeing Gideon go down, Callahan threw his ruined rifle aside and drew a long, serrated Bowie knife. He charged across the snow, realizing the only way to get to the girl was over Gideon's dead body. Gideon's guns clicked empty. With a roar, Callahan lunged, driving the knife downward. Gideon caught the outlaw's wrist in a desperate two-handed grip, stopping the blade inches from his throat. The 2 men crashed into the snow at the very edge of the gorge. Callahan was fresh, driven by rage and desperation. Gideon was bleeding out, exhausted from a 3-day siege. Slowly, agonizingly, Callahan began to force the blade down closer to Gideon's neck. "I'm going to gut you like a pig, Reed," Callahan spat, saliva flying into Gideon's face. "And then I'm going to take that girl back to the ranch." Gideon's vision swam. The pain in his leg was blinding, but as he looked up into the eyes of the man who had murdered his friend, the man who had branded the woman he had just sworn to protect, a final primal surge of adrenaline flooded his veins. "Not today," Gideon snarled. With a sudden, violent twist of his hips, Gideon rolled, using Callahan's own downward momentum against him. I threw the outlaw off balance, driving his knee fiercely into Callahan's stomach. As Callahan gasped, Gideon wrenched the knife from his grip, reversed it, and drove the blade deeply into Callahan's ribs. Callahan's eyes went wide with shock. He stared at Gideon, his mouth opening in a silent, bloody gasp. "That was for Sam Ford," Gideon whispered, "and this..." With a brutal shove, Gideon kicked Callahan backward. "Is for Abigail." Callahan stumbled backward, clutching his chest. His heel caught the slick ice at the edge of the chasm. For a split second, he hung suspended over the 300-foot drop, his arms windmilling in the air. Then, without a sound, Josiah Callahan disappeared over the edge, swallowed by the swirling white mist of Dead Man's Drop. The remaining outlaws, seeing their invincible warlord fall to his death, immediately turned and fled back down the mountain, scattering into the trees like frightened dogs. Silence descended on the ridge, broken only by the howl of the wind. Gideon lay in the blood-stained snow, staring up at the slate-gray sky, his breathing shallow. He closed his eyes, ready to let the cold take him. Then hands were on him, warm, frantic hands. "Gideon! Gideon, look at me!" He opened his eyes. Abigail was kneeling over him, having run back across the bridge. She was weeping, her hands pressing desperately against the bleeding wounds in his leg. "You promised me," she sobbed, burying her face into his chest. "You promised you would live for me. Don't you dare die now." Gideon managed a weak, blood-stained smile. He reached up, his trembling hand resting on her hair. "I ain't going nowhere, Abigail. I think I've had enough of the quiet life." 3 weeks later, in the bustling city of Denver, Colorado, a heavy oilskin pouch was dropped onto the polished mahogany desk of James McParland, the legendary superintendent of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. McParland opened the ledger, his eyes widening as he read the names, the dates, and the amounts. It was the key to dismantling the most corrupt political ring in the Northwest. He looked up at the couple standing on the other side of his desk. The man was heavily scarred, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, yet he stood with the undeniable posture of a soldier. The woman beside him was beautiful, her dark hair pinned back, her arm linked securely through his. Beneath the collar of her high-necked dress, hidden from the world, was a scar that had once been a mark of ownership, but was now a testament to her unbreakable survival. They walked out of the Pinkerton office into the bright, blinding sunshine of a new city, leaving the ghosts of the Bitterroot Mountains far behind them. Gideon pulled Abigail close, kissing the top of her head. The winter was finally over. If your heart was pounding during Gideon and Abigail's harrowing escape over Dead Man's Drop, you are not alone. The American frontier was unforgiving, and survival often meant finding the strength you never knew you had, or finding someone worth fighting for. Did Gideon's ultimate revenge satisfy you? Let us know your thoughts below. If you love this intense, pulse-pounding tale of Wild West justice and romance, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another epic historical adventure.